All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 75 for June 2025. Laurel Hill and some titled Nobility. Laurel Hill East is a National Historic Landmark, an arboretum, a sculpture garden, a nature preserve, and an active cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It opened in 1836, and it remains a popular visiting spot for tens of thousands of visitors every year. Its sister cemetery, Laurel Hill West, located across the Schuylkill River in Ballackinwood, was founded in 1869. It has a history and a population of its own. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University in Philadelphia, volunteer tour guide at Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West, and volunteer podcaster. And if you're a big fan of All Bones Considered and Biographical Bites from Bala, first book of biographical sketches will be released in a few months. All Bones Considered, 52 Laurel Hill Women. It should be an ideal addition to the library of anyone who likes short biographies, Philadelphia, U.S., and women's history. I do hope this is the first in a series of 4 books that I will release over the next 5 years. I've got some book signings set up already in September. Other author events I will let you know as time comes closer. And in the meantime, I actually have a pre-publication write-up from Kirkus Review, and it is positive, so you can check that out. June 2025 episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, tells of the widow of hatmaker John B. Stetson, who became Countess Santa Eulalia, the Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys, and Baron James Ivan Michael von Suttka, whose titles may or may not have been real, Clarence Wiener, whose mother Eugenia became Baroness von Graetner, and whose own life resembled the famed German folk hero Baron von Munchausen, and Princess Olga Demidov-Trubetskoy Stover, who ended up buried on an island off of Spain. The entire podcast is available on June 1st. Each segment will be released as an individual episode in the days that follow. All this and much more this month on All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 75 for June 2025. Laurel Hill and Titled Nobility, Part 1. Countess Santa Eulalia, Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys, Baron James Ivan Michael von Suttka, Baroness Eugenia Wiener von Graetner and Clarence Wiener, and as a rerun from 5 years ago, Princess Olga Demidov-Trubetskoy Stover. American Nobility and Dollar Princesses. Maybe by the time you hear this podcast, the answer will be clear. Is Pope Leo XIV still a U.S. citizen? When Robert Francis Prevost stunned the world by his election as Supreme Pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church in May 2025, he was citizen of 3 countries. His birth in Chicago earned him U.S. citizenship. His mission work in South America eventually earned him Peruvian citizenship in 2015, and his move to the Holy See in 2023 gained him citizenship of Vatican City. With a population well under 1,000 and a total area of 121 acres, I mean, it's larger than Laurel Hill East, but smaller than Laurel Hill West, the Vatican City State has been an independent, landlocked sovereign state since the Lateran Treaty of 1929. The Holy See is one of the last 7 remaining absolute monarchies in the world, along with Saudi Arabia, Eswatini, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Brunei, and Oman. There are many titles for the Bishop of Rome: Vicar of Jesus Christ, Successor of the Prince of the Apostles, Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, Patriarch of the West, Primate of Italy, Archbishop and Metropolitan of the Roman Province, Sovereign of the Vatican City State, and Servant of the Servants of God. The name Pope does not appear on that list of official titles. In 2005, the United States Justice Department ruled that the Pope enjoys head of state immunity. Now, when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, they were extremely careful to avoid the problems of their forebears. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 states, quote, "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatsoever from any king, prince, or foreign state." End quote. So to me, I'm not a lawyer, sounds like the Pope needs to get dispensation from Congress to remain a United States citizen. Well, does that mean that Grace Kelly of East Falls relinquished her citizenship when she married Prince Rainier of Monaco in 1956? She did not. However, when her son, Prince Albert II, a U.S. citizen because of his mother's citizenship, became Prince of Monaco in 2005, he did give up his U.S. citizenship. African-American entertainer Josephine Baker renounced her U.S. citizenship in 1937 when she became a citizen of France. Monty Python's American member Terry Gilliam renounced his U.S. citizenship in 2006. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was born in New York City, gave up his United States citizenship in 2016 when he became Foreign Secretary for the United Kingdom. Other familiar names who were once U.S. citizens: Christina Onassis, Una O'Neill, Tina Turner. In 1963, San Francisco native Hope Cook ceased to be a U.S. citizen when she married Sikkim's crown prince. But she regained her citizenship when she returned to the United States in 1981 after her husband was deposed. There was a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would have called for any U.S. citizen who received a title of nobility to renounce citizenship. Quote, "If any citizen of the United States shall accept, claim, receive, or retain any title of nobility or honor, or shall, without the consent of Congress, accept and retain any present, pension, office, or emolument of any kind whatsoever from any king, emperor, prince, or foreign power, such person shall cease to be a citizen of the United States, and shall be incapable of holding any office of trust or profit under them, or either of them." Now, this proposed amendment would amplify both Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, which prohibits federal government from issuing titles of nobility or honor, and Section 10, Clause 1, which prohibits the states from issuing them. This all started because in 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte's younger brother, Jerome Bonaparte, married Betsy Patterson from Baltimore, Maryland. Now, following the birth of their son, she sought aristocratic recognition from France. The child, named Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte, was born in the United Kingdom on July 7th, 1805, rather than in the United States. But despite this, he would have possessed U.S. citizenship through his mother. The intent behind this amendment was to prevent individuals holding foreign titles, along with the associated allegiance demanded by those titles, from running for governmental office in the newly established republic. This measure was implemented out of concern that foreign powers granting these titles might use them as leverage to influence legislation, either favoring or obstructing the enactment of laws contrary to their interests. The Titles of Nobility Amendment was introduced in the Senate by Democratic Republican Senator Philip Reed of Maryland. It was passed in the Senate on April 27, 1810, by a vote of 19-5, and sent to the House of Representatives for its consideration. It was passed by the House on May 1, 1810, by a vote of 87-3. Having been approved by Congress, the proposed amendment was sent to the state legislatures for ratification. Maryland was first up, Christmas Day, 1810. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey all ratified it during the first 2 weeks of February, 1811. But then it died. The amendment was rejected by Virginia, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. It did not reach the two-third majority necessary. Rhode Island's rejection on September 15, 1814, ended the process. No other state has voted on this proposed amendment in more than 210 years. Now, some people, known as 13thers, have claimed that the Titles of Nobility Amendment did become part of the Constitution, since it was mistakenly published as the 13th Amendment in some early 19th century printings of the Constitution by the Philadelphia printing house of Bio-Wren and Duane. William John Duane, who also published the Aurora and was father of Elizabeth Duane Gillespie. She was in All Bones considered number 60 for March 2024. He is interred at Laurel Hill East. Oh, it's a good thing that this amendment was never approved, or a lot of Americans would have had to relinquish their citizenship during the Gilded Age cash for titles system. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, much of European nobility was strapped for cash. And for about 30 years, between 400 and 500 American dollar princesses brought an estimated $25 billion into the British economy while they took on the title of Baroness, Countess, Duchess, or Marchioness. In the United States, especially in the high society in New York, Newport, and the East Coast, a title was a shortcut to social acceptance, and nobility was available for a price. Titles for sale was such a common occurrence that American heiresses had a quarterly magazine they could consult. It was called The Titled American. It contained a register of all the available titled bachelors who were still on the market. A catalog. When married, a dollar princess often found herself isolated and miserable in a ramshackle house located miles from nowhere, with only open fires for heat and no running water, or horror of horrors, no indoor bathrooms. All of these women were used to hot running water and showers. These were abominable conditions. Some of these were women who used to order 90 dresses at the beginning of every season, and they would wear each of them only once before they discarded it. And now they were in this abandoned castle in the middle of nowhere. In 1895 alone, 9 American heiresses married members of the English aristocracy, and by the end of the century, a quarter of the House of Lords had a transatlantic connection. The idiom blue blood, to indicate people of noble birth or descent, has been around since the early 19th century. It derives from the Spanish royal family nobility, whose superficial veins showed blue through their untanned skin, unlike the peasants whose tanned skin masked the azure blue. What are the titles that women could enter with marriage? A few made it to the ranks of royalty. In addition to Princess Grace, America has also had Princess Lee Radziwill of the Bouvier family, and Nanny Mae Stewart of Zanesville, Ohio, whose third marriage in 1920 was to Prince Christopher of Greece and Denmark, which made her Princess Anastasia of Greece and Denmark. The term royal princess refers to the oldest daughter of a reigning monarch and is addressed as Your Royal Highness. There have only been 7 royal princesses. Now, obviously, that is not a rank that you can buy. Now, below the royalty comes the nobility, and below the prince and princess, the first of the 5 peerage levels is the duke and the duchess. Americans Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, and Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, are examples. Dukes and duchesses can be separated into royal or sovereign and non-royal. Royal dukes are referred to as Your Highness. Dukes usually rule a duchy or a dukedom, but don't confuse that with a grand duchy. A grand duchy is a country or a territory whose official head of state is a Grand Duke or a Grand Duchess. Now, history gives us dozens of Grand Duchies: Tuscany, Baden, Transylvania. Currently, there's only one Grand Duchy in the world, Luxembourg, a sovereign Grand Duchy since 1815. To add to the confusion on dukes, the King of England is also called the Duke of Normandy. Other current royal dukedoms of the United Kingdoms: Duke of Cornwall, also called the Prince of Wales, that's Prince William; Duke of Sussex, Prince Harry; the Duke of York, Prince Andrew, younger brother of Charles III; Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Edward, brother of Charles III; Duke of Kent, first cousin once removed from Charles III. There are also 24 non-royal dukes. Although some dukes can also be earls, there is no such thing as a Duke of Earl, no matter what Gene Chandler sang in his 1961 Top 40 hit. The next level: Marquis, Marquise, or Marchioness, who earn the honorarium Most Honorable or My Lord Lady. Introduced in 1835, this title historically refers to a count or an earl who holds a frontier district. The word is derived from the French word for frontier. In other words, this was a duke who was trusted to care for the security of the outskirts of the kingdom. Today, a marquis is simply a British peer who ranks below dukes and above earls. The marquis title is passed down the male heir. If there are no male heirs, the title reverts to the monarchy. Mary Leiter, daughter of Levi Leiter, married Honorable John Curzon, later first Marquis Curzon of Kettleston, eldest son of the 4th Baron Scarsdale in 1895. So when her husband was appointed as Viceroy of India in 1899, she became the Vicereine of India. This made her the highest-ranking American-born woman in the history of the British Empire. Her name again was Mary Leiter. Only one woman has been named a Marchioness on her own right, not through marriage, and that is Anne Boleyn, just before she married Henry VIII. The best-known American Marchioness is probably Grace Elvina Hines from Decatur, Alabama. Her second marriage was to George Nathaniel Curzon, which made her Marchioness Curzon of Kettleston. Counts and countesses are next in the hierarchy. Rose Kennedy was ennobled by the Holy See. Newspaper publisher Sissy Patterson was ennobled by marriage. Perhaps the most famous Philadelphia countess was Margaretta Armstrong Drexel, granddaughter of banker and university founder Anthony Joseph Drexel. On June 8, 1910, Margaretta Armstrong Drexel married Guy Finch Hatton, Viscount Maidstone by the Bishop of London, at St. Margaret's, Westminster, becoming Margaretta Armstrong Finch Hatton, Countess of Winchelsea and Nottingham. The reception at the Drexel home, 22 Grosvenor Square, was attended by 1,500 guests. Viscount comes from the Latin vicecomes, or vicecomes, meaning vice-count, or below a count, indicating its ranking as below earls, who are themselves equivalent to a continental count. The rank was created in 1440. The feminine form of viscount is viscountess. The office of baron was introduced in 1387 officially, although the title was used as early as the 13th century. Baron refers to landholding nobleman. This title is passed to the eldest son of the title holder, but it can pass to a daughter if there are no sons. Title holders are addressed as Lord or Lady. An American example is the 5th Baron Hayden Guest, Christopher, and his wife, Lady Hayden Guest. You know her better as Jamie Lee Curtis. Before there were barons and marquesses and viscounts, there were earls. This is a title introduced in the early 11th century, derived from the Old English word for warrior, nobleman. This title is passed down to the next direct male heir. Title holders are addressed as my lord, my lady, and then there are other titles of the British peerage, including knights and squires, or esquires. We will not go into those today. A marriage between an American heiress and a British title was almost exclusively a business deal, a loveless marriage for the purpose of creating an heir. But some of these American women became part of British history. Jeanette Jenny Jerome. She was the daughter of a Brooklyn businessman, Leonard Jerome. She married Lord Randolph Churchill, the third son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough in 1874. And they were the parents of Sir Winston Churchill. In 1880, New York heiress Frances Ellen Work married Honorable James Boothby Burke Roach, who would later become the 3rd Baron Frenoys. Their third child was the Honorable Edmund Maurice Burke Roach, 4th Baron Frenoys, who was the maternal grandfather of Diana, Princess of Wales. And then there was Nancy Witcher Astor from Virginia, who after a failed marriage to Robert Gould Shaw II, first cousin of the Civil War hero of the same name, married American-born Englishman Waldorf Astor, who succeeded to the peerage and entered the House of Lords. The Viscountess Nancy ran for and won a seat in the House of Commons. Nobility tended to occur in monarchies, although it also existed in non-kingly countries, such as the Dutch Republic from the 1580s to the 1790s, the Republic of Genoa, the Republic of Venice, the Old Swiss Confederacy. All had nobility, despite not having monarchs. Now, so far, I have found 8 people at Laurel Hill who either have titles or claim to have titles. I got a princess, 2 barons, 2 baronesses, 2 countesses, and a marquis. Sarah Elizabeth Shindler de Queiroz, a.k.a. Countess Santa Eulalia, was hatmaker John B. Stetson's 3rd wife. She received her title from a marriage to Portuguese nobleman Alexo de Queiroz Ribeiro, the first and only Count of Santa Eulalia. James Ivan Michael von Suttka has a cenotaph in Section J that identifies him as a baron. His obituary also claims he was an Olympic champion pistol shooter and a member of the U.S. Marine Corps. Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys was a purported Belgian nobleman, but many society types seem to remember him as a German valet in Europe prior to the Great War. Clarence Wiener's widowed mother married a violinist named Baron Louis Amadeus von Graetner. Sometimes he went by Ludwig also. Clarence was himself a perfect example of someone suffering from the malady named for the historical German Baron von Munchausen. And as an encore presentation, I will retell you a story I told about 5 years ago of Russian Princess Olga Demidov-Trubetskoy-Stover. She married a Philadelphia archaeologist, but she ended up running high-end brothels in New York City and London. And there are 3 left over. There's another Baron, Ettore Romano Benedetto Fontana. He's buried in the Dulles Mausoleum in Laurel Hill South. His wife couldn't divorce him on time, so he was reluctantly interred with the Dulles family. That includes William Crothers Dulles. He died on the RMS Titanic. His body was recovered. So that's the Titanic Mausoleum there. And there is Mildred Roderfield Love Lowenhelm, an opera singer who married and became Countess Brockenhuis von Lowenhelm. And finally, the Baroness Beatrice Bailey von Wollerstorff. I will save them for another podcast. For now, let's get started. Elizabeth Libby Shindler Stetson, Countess Santa Eulalia, 1858-1929. Eulalia is a Greek name. It means well-spoken. Saint Eulalia is a very early Spanish saint, or possibly 2 saints. There's Saint Eulalia of Merida. She was a 13-year-old virgin who refused to accept the Roman gods over her chosen Christianity. She was stripped by the soldiers, tortured with hooks and torches, and burned at the stake until she suffocated from smoke inhalation. As she released her last breath, a dove flew out of her mouth, which frightened away the soldiers. A miraculous snow then covered her nakedness, which the Church interpreted as purity worthy of sainthood. She and Saint Julia of Merida, who died in a similar fashion, have feast days celebrated on December 10th. Eulalia's death is represented in the classic oil painting by Pre-Raphaelite stylist John William Waterhouse. Then there is Saint Eulalia of Barcelona, same age, born in the same year, swept up in the same persecutions from the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Her tortures included being placed in a barrel full of broken glass and being rolled down a hill, culminated in her crucifixion on an X-shaped cross, a so-called saltire. Although some scholars feel that she was tortured on the saltire until she died and then her body just left on display. Either is pretty horrifying. This Eulalia is co-patron saint of Barcelona, where her name figures prominently with statues and street names. Her feast day is on the anniversary of her death, February 12th. Well, other than Spain, there are other locations named Eulalia in France and Portugal, as well as in a Eulalia township in Potter County in north-central Pennsylvania. A couple of years ago, Laurel Hill West performed a mausoleum inventory. There are nearly 300 family mausoleums on the 200-acre grounds. This would be an opportunity to confirm that the records in the archives matched what was in the mausoleums. There were lots of surprises, including some previously unrecognized signed stained glass windows. One of the mausoleums that I inventoried was that of hatmaker, philanthropist, university namesake John Batterson Stetson. I talked about him more than 5 years ago, one of the first episodes of All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories. There were crypts from floor to ceiling on both sides, and the cover of the crypt on the upper right, which was not visible through the door, was inscribed Sarah Elizabeth Stetson, Condessa de Santa Eulalia. Now, as a reminder, John Batterson Stetson was one of the good bosses during the Gilded Age. He treated his employees very fairly. Starting wages higher than almost anybody else in town. Raises were frequent and generous. People stayed with the company for 30, 40 years, unheard of in the hat-making business. He built company houses around the factory in northeast Philadelphia, and then he sold them or rented them at reasonable costs. He even built a hospital for his workers so they would not have to pay out of pocket for their medical care. Stetson's first marriage was to 19-year-old Nancy Haynes. Their children were Wilhelmina, whom everyone called Minnie, and John, who apparently died soon after birth. This marriage ended in divorce sometime before 1867, but I couldn't find any details. He did marry Harriet Harkness in 1867. They had no children together, and this marriage ended 16 years later when Harriet died in an asylum. And I find nothing about this in newspapers or in Stetson biographies. Harriet has kind of disappeared from the face of the earth. I emailed both the archivist at Stetson University in Florida and the historian at Stetson House seeking more information about the first two marriages. I did not hear back from either of them. So sometime in the mid-1880s, there was a Midwest farm girl named Sarah Elizabeth Shindler. Everybody called her Libby. She traveled from her home in Orleans, Indiana, to visit an aunt in Philadelphia who was marrying Edward Harkness. He was a purchasing agent with the John B. Stetson Company. The family attended church services on Sunday, but the regular organist was a no-show. Libby's family knew that she played organ at home. They encouraged her to step forward and play. She did this and apparently caught the eye of the man himself, the owner of the world's largest hat factory. Despite an age difference of almost 30 years, she was 25, he was 54, the two fell in love and they married. As a gift, Stetson built his new Hoosier in-laws a fine new house in 1894. It became known as the house that hats built. Within the first 3 years of marriage, Libby and John had 3 children. John Batterson Stetson Jr., who grew up to be United States Minister to Poland from 1925 to 1929. Benjamin Shindler Stetson, who died at age 6 in Italy in 1897. And George Henry Stetson, who lived to be 96. He's buried in Los Angeles. The Stetson lived at 1717 Spring Garden in the city, but they spent a lot of time at their suburban estate, Idro, I-D-R-O. It had 107 acres at Ashburn and Oakland Roads above Oak Lane. It's about 8 miles north of City Hall, Elkins Park. Idro is an exact reproduction of the French chateau in Touraine. Libby was accepted as an active member of Philadelphia society. She joined the Acorn Club, the Art Alliance, National Society of Colonial Dames. And when John B. died in 1906, I've read that he was initially interred at Laurel Hill East and later moved to a family mausoleum in the Ashland section of Laurel Hill West. I've not been able to confirm that just yet. The mausoleum he has could use some work. The stained glass is broken. There's no good lighting that comes inside. Occasionally somebody will leave an old Boss of the Plains, an old 10-gallon hat leaning against the mausoleum door. It's always a treat when you see that. John Stetson left an estate worth about $7 million. The youngest son, who went by G. Henry, was 19 when his father died. Disappointed they would have to get along on only $5,000 a year. That's $54,000 a year today. He got around this when he eloped to Atlantic City with Miss Helen Lewis, daughter of the head gardener at Idro. And his father's will did not prohibit this marriage, so he was able to double his inheritance by eloping and getting married. Libby was still less than 50 years old when John died. Still a very attractive woman also, so suitors started to call, including European nobility in search of a dollar princess. Among them was a mustachioed Portuguese sculptor known in the United States as Alexis Santa Eulalia, although his full name was Alexo de Quiros Ribeiro de Sotomayor de Almeida y Vasconcelos, 1868-1917. Alexo was the son of Gaspar de Quiros Botelho de Almeida y Vasconcelos. His genealogy includes many noblemen and lords, including his paternal grandfather, Gaspar de Quiros Botelho de Almeida y Vasconcelos, 1760 to 1834. His titles include Professed Knight in the Order of Our Lord Jesus Christ, Lord of the House of Sotelo, de Paco, Boavista, Patron, and Cutada, Sergeant Major of Ordnances of Arcos de Valdevez, and provider of the Santa Casa de Misericordia de Arcos de Valdevez between 1789 and 1799. Alexo also claimed to be first cousin to the Portuguese king Dom Carlos I, who would be assassinated in 1908. Alexo spent some time in college. He studied literature, but he abandoned his studies to dedicate himself to fine arts, with a special emphasis on sculpture. This started as a child. In 1891, he moved to Paris and took up life at the École des Beaux-Arts, where he stayed for 15 years. And within his first year, he exhibited one of his works in plaster at the Salon. The following year, 2 other works were accepted in bronze, a bust of a Roman and a head of Christ. While in Paris, Alexo also attended the School of Decorative Arts, the Julian Academy, and the School of Fine Arts. In Portugal, where he was already a recognized artist, he was commissioned to create the bronze statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus made for the sanctuary of Santa Luzia in Viana do Castelo. He heard about the International Exposition in St. Louis in 1904, and he moved to the United States, where he planned to erect a bust of Napoleon Bonaparte in the Exposition Park, but never got further than making a model. The exposition, of course, was to celebrate the centennial celebration of the Louisiana Purchase, when President Jefferson bought the land from Napoleon. After a bout of typhus, Alexo moved a few hundred miles north of Chicago, where he said that he was Consul of Portugal. The government did not recognize him as such. He made friends among the rich of that city and was introduced to members of the upper class. It was Chicago, where 36-year-old Portuguese sculptor was introduced to the 50-year-old Elizabeth Shindler Stetson. Details on who introduced them and where are sketchy, although I've read it was Mrs. Marshall Field. In July 1908, a formal announcement was sent to newspapers. Quote, "The engagement is announced of the Count Santa Eulalia to Mrs. E. Elizabeth Stetson. The latter is the widow of John B. Stetson of Philadelphia. Count Eulalia, who is about 50 years of age, he was actually closer to 35, is a member of one of the oldest and most representative families of Portugal. His ancestors for generations, Hidalgos Cavaleiros de Casa Real of Portugal. One of them, Don Manuel Pinto Ribeiro de Fonseca, was in 1484 Grand Master of the Crusades, the only Portuguese to be so honored. The Count is a sculptor of considerable note, his works having been placed in various cities of Europe and America. He was the recipient of the Grand Prix of Paris Salon in 1892. But there was questioning, some doubt as to that title, Count. March 19, 1907, the Chicago Tribune published an article that began, quote, Some cynical persons have been casting doubts on the genuineness of the title of nobility possessed by the Count of Santa Eulalia, a friend of Mrs. Marshall Field, Miss Frances Keep, Mrs. Franklin McVeigh. The reporter for this story said that the Count was a slender, soldierly-appearing man who wears good jewelry, including a gold seal ring with a crest. He had some cases of Madeira of 1815 with him, which he said was worth $50 a bottle. It's about $1,700 a bottle today for what would have been 85-year-old Madeira. March 20th, 1907, Chicago Tribune published this. Count Santa Eulalia, who made himself popular with Chicago society leaders, yesterday confounded his detractors and made good on his claim that he is the official consular representative in this city of His Majesty the King of Portugal. As to his right to the title of nobility that he had engraved on his visiting cards, there remains no doubt. It was of recent acquisition. In the afternoon, he attended a tea given by Mrs. Marshall Field at her residence, 1905 Prairie Avenue. He wore his gorgeous court uniform, which cost 1,000 pesos. Money in Portugal was estudos, not pesos, so I don't know what 1,000 pesos was supposed to represent or how much it cost in 1900. Anyway, in addition to the court uniform, and his court sword, which has been in his family a long time, he says. He also wore spurs, small gilt affairs, filed off at the rowels so they wouldn't tear the long trains of the women at society affairs. End quote. Brilliant. So these fancy guys with titles who would wear boots with spurs would actually file the points off the spurs so they wouldn't tear the gowns of the women at the balls, the gowns of the women they might dance with. Wow. The luncheon was in honor of Monsignor Silva of Lisbon, who had known Alexis back home. He said, I was asked by the Chancellor of the Archdiocese of Chicago when I reached this city if I were acquainted with the Count Santa Eulalia, the consul for Portugal in the city. I said I was not. When I was introduced to the Count, I found that I had known him in Lisbon, slightly, under the name of Mr. Roberto. He moves in good society in London. He told me he'd been appointed consul there and that his title had been confirmed after I left Lisbon last August. I had no reason to doubt his word. I did not ask to see his papers. The article also noted that, quote, the Count had plenty of official-looking envelopes from Lisbon addressed to His Excellency the Count of Santa Eulalia, His Most Faithful Majesty's Consul. Later, the Count brought out decorations that he had received at one time or another from appreciative kings and queens and societies for his work as sculptor. There was a Star of Ethiopia, there was the Order of the Christ of Portugal, and several others. Mrs. Marshall Field said that there was no question that Count Santa Eulalia was consul. I don't know about his title of nobility, but he is a gentleman or he would not be my guest. This story was important enough to be syndicated and used by several other newspapers, and that seemed to settle the question. Was he a real count? And it settled it temporarily. Alexi's courtship of Mrs. Stetson was not discussed in any newspaper throughout 1907 or early 1908. So that announcement on Monday, July 20th, 1908, came as a surprise. Mrs. John B. Stetson and Count Santa Eulalia were engaged to be married, followed the next day by a denial of an impending wedding. But Tuesday afternoon, there was a hurried visit to the Montgomery County Courthouse in Norristown, followed by a wedding on Wednesday. And by Saturday, July 25th, they were aboard a steamer on their way to a European honeymoon. The marriage at her Edro estate in the drawing room under a canopy of flowers made newspapers across the country, with headlines varying from the simple "Widow of hat manufacturer marries Portuguese count" to Portuguese count weds millions. Although Libby did not embrace the Catholic faith, she was raised a Baptist, she had to receive a dispensation from Philadelphia's Archbishop Ryan, so the marriage ceremony was performed by Monsignor James P. Turner. Very private service, only a handful of guests. Libby's son, John B. Stetson Jr., gave her away at the altar. Not only was the press not allowed inside, they were not allowed within 50 feet of the house. Quote, all entrances to the estate were closely guarded by a score of athletic servitors, assisted by constables and members of the Cheltenham police force. Reporters and spectators alike were rejected by guards who were not at all gentle in their work. End quote. After the wedding breakfast, the newlyweds posed on the front lawn for several pictures by professional photographers and friends, but the ban on newspaper photographers remained. Only weeks before the wedding, on February 1st, 1908, King Don Carlos of Portugal and his heir apparent and eldest son, Prince Royal Dom Louis Philippe, Duke of Braganza, were assassinated in Lisbon. So Santa Eulalia now represented the government of 18-year-old King Manuel II, better known as Manuel the Unfortunate. He was Portugal's last king, as the monarchy ended in 1910 and was replaced with a republic. The Count's gift to his bride was a set of jewels that were heirlooms in the Santa Eulalia family. The Washington Post was careful to say, quote, while he is not a man of great wealth, the income from his estates is said to be sufficient to make him independent and always to have enabled him to fulfill the social duties of his rank, end quote. An odd event, which emerged only later, was that somehow, despite heightened security, a strange woman had made her way onto the grounds of Idro on the wedding day. She would not give her name. She only insisted that her card be taken to the Count, who she said would be glad to see her. Despite her insistence, her card was not taken by anyone, and she was escorted off the property. Trouble started the day after the newlyweds sailed for Europe aboard the steamer Carmania, a Cunard liner built in 1905. Quote, it is reported that the relatives of the late hat manufacturer, who are not satisfied with their share of the estate, believe that before Count Eulalia gave the former Mrs. Stetson a title by marrying her, he received a large dowry. If this can be proven, it is said by those who are familiar with the will of the deceased millionaire, that he took precautions that in the event of his widow remarrying, her husband could not benefit in any way from the estate he had left. The relatives, led by Mrs. Henry H. Roloffs, who had been Wilhelmina Minnie Stetson, daughter from her father's first marriage in 1850. This is a struggle which had been developing since her father's death, when she felt cheated by only being bequeathed $100,000. Other family got tired of listening to her complain and contributed to give her an additional $150,000 just to make her stop complaining. Specifically, what Stetson's will stated is, quote, item, it is expressly my will that the income which I have hereinbefore directed to be paid to my wife and children respectively is to be for their respective sole and separate and exclusive use and benefits. September 1910, a story exploded out of Chicago that Mrs. William Franklin Ernest, I've also seen it spelled Ernst, but it's Ernest, wife of a surgeon from Ashcombe, Illinois, stated she was owed $10,000 for playing matchmaker between the Count and the Countess. According to Mrs. Ernest, she, quote, picked Santa Eulalia in Chicago, the same as any other raw material, and turned him into a polished, finished product, only to be ignored and scorned. I feel sorry for Mrs. Stetson, and for her sake must refrain from stating the details of my claim. But I can assure you that the story will make exceedingly interesting reading when the case is heard in court. I am prepared to show every movement the Count has made in the last 5 years after I met him at the Alliance Francaise, and I will have between 20 and 40 witnesses help me with my case. I've been accustomed to meet people of the highest type of heart and mind culture, and then I have my charity patients, and Count Santa Eulalia was one of the latter. Well, he talked to me just as a child would talk to his mother, and told me it was the desire of his family to have him marry a wealthy woman. The fact that he did not have the title of Count was our secret, and part of our plan was to get it for him. I fitted the Count out with good clothes, prompted him on how to behave, and then Mrs. Bishop and I arranged that Mrs. Stetson should call upon Mrs. Bishop at the Chicago Beach Hotel. That was 8 months after Mr. Stetson's death. At first, the Count did not progress rapidly with his courtship because of his personal faults, and he made good headway by the correspondence route because I wrote every letter that the Countess ever received from him. I framed the proposal of marriage. I argued away every objection she offered to accepting the Count in marriage. It was a hard 2 years' work, but I was finally successful. The Count and the Countess objected vehemently. I did not know such a woman as Mrs. Joseph P. Ernest, and a statement that she brought about the meeting between myself and my husband is simply preposterous. I cannot imagine the purpose in circulating such reports of threatening a suit. I shall pay no further attention to the matter, and I'm sure the Count will follow the same course. Despite denials, the case proceeded and came to court in October, where Mrs. Ernest made good on her threat by producing many letters which she said she had personally written to the Countess as part of the Count's courtship. My dearest friend, if God ever gives me a mate who will know how to support me by her affection and enthusiasm for that art which is so dear to me, I know that I will be able to realize my ambition. Loving and working, what happiness! Until now, Europe and art was sufficient for me, but lack of love makes my heart feel so empty. I know you because for me you represent the refinement, the modesty, and at the same time I can see your noble ambition to serve humanity. They say a man is as young as he feels, and a woman is as young as she looks. Consequently, we are of the same age, as my studies make my head and heart older than yours, and your black hair and active life will always keep you young. I pass my days very agreeably with my lady friends, but your letters always make me desire a home. Your ever devoted Alex. Mrs. Ernest read another letter that she said she had written between the time of the Count's proposal for marriage and her acceptance. My dear friend, I believe you're forgetting me. Maybe I will have a long letter tomorrow giving me the answer that I have been longing for so many days. All my wishes are for your happiness. And if I am to experience the sorrow of a disappointment, I will, however, ask heaven to give you all that your heart may desire for yourself and for those who are dear to you. Your own Alexis. Mrs. Ernest said that Miss Stetson originally rejected the Count as she found that he was too old. He was actually 10 years younger than Libby. And because she feared her millions rather than her personal charms were the chief attraction for the Count. She also didn't like that he wore a toupee after she touched his head and his hair moved. A few months later, Mrs. Ernest submitted an itemized bill that included writing love letters at $5 each, $500, introducing Count to wealthy widow, $1,000, schooling Count in courtship, $500. Introducing Count to society, $1,000. In February 1910, an announcement of impending divorce between Count and Countess was published. They'd traveled to Europe together the year before, but the Countess returned to America in December. Alexis was to remain in Europe long enough for the Countess to file divorce papers under the claim of desertion. That same day, another newspaper article reported that Count Santa Eulalia had sold Portuguese royal decorations to Chicagoans at 1,000% profit, and that his acts as consul in Chicago were under investigation by the Portuguese government. He'd sold them to finance his courtship of Mrs. Stetson and to purchase a title. That's right, despite his posturing, he was not a count when he married Libby. The title First Count of Santa Eulalia was granted to him by decree of King Manuel II of Portugal on September 3rd, 1908, that is several months after the wedding. But despite the threat of the separation, 2 years later the twosome was still together. They went to Indiana to visit her family, and they were interviewed while they were there. They signed into the hotel as being from PA. Nobody knew whether that meant Pennsylvania or Paris. A newspaper reporter said, "The Count is a big, fine-looking fellow with an abundance of black hair and a liberal allowance of black whiskers and mustache. Carries a light-colored cane with a crooked end. He was a jolly good fellow, too, as was evidenced by his jovial manner. The Countess is a handsome American woman." Alexis continued his career as a sculptor. In 1914, he exhibited a rendering of one of his mentors, Irish-American sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. It shows St. Gaudens seated deep in thought, with his chin resting on his left hand. That sound like a familiar pose? It's the same one that Rodin had used 10 years earlier when he created his iconic statue, The Thinker. That same year, 1914, there was yet another unbelievable story out of Philadelphia. M. Blair Cohn, chief investigator for an organization called the Illinois White Slave Commission, thought about suing, it was unclear who, for $40,000, allegedly due to him for services as an alleged attempt to place Countess Santa Eulalia on the throne of Portugal as its queen. Cohen alleged that he had been sent to Washington to sound the Taft administration and the Senate as to its attitude in case an American would be placed on the throne. A Portuguese Wikipedia and Google Translate, I had to use both of them, informed me that Alexis died in May 1917 as a result of a violent collision following a horse cart accident while he was building the monastery of Santa Maria de Refoias de Lima in Portugal. In December 1939, the Indianapolis Courier-Star gave a page-long summary of their local girl who had become nobility and said that the Count had died in a hunting accident. Alexis Purchas Title died when he did. Alexo de Quiros de Almeida e Vasconcelos was the one and only Count of Santa Eulalia, and Elizabeth Shindler Stetson was the one and only Countess. 1922, article in the Philadelphia Public Ledger. Countess Eulalia is ready to sell off the 107 acres of Edro for the development of a country club, golf club, called Ashburn Country Club. That sale did not happen. Philadelphia Inquirer, April 23, 1929. The Countess Santa Eulalia, mother of John B. Stetson, Jr., United States Minister to Poland, who died suddenly Sunday at her ranch at San Fernando, California, will be buried from her late residence, Edro, at Elkins Park, when her body arrives here next week. The Countess was 71 and left her Elkins Park estate several weeks ago to spend the spring on her ranch. Count Eulalia died in Portugal in May 1917 after being married to Mrs. Stetson for 9 years. At the time of her death, Libby Stetson's net worth was estimated at $6 million. That's not too much less than what she inherited from John B. Stetson 23 years earlier. The stock market crash occurred 6 months later. Franz Eskens, birth year unknown to 1923, a.k.a. Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys, and James Suttka, 1905-1977, a.k.a. Baron James Ivan Michael von Suttka. I came on two of today's subjects by accident. Back when I was working on the podcast about the 4 Laurel Hill residents who were killed in the Indian Wars, I visited the final resting place of Clayton French. Nearby, I noticed an impressive-looking sarcophagus with the name Baron James Ivan Michael von Suttka. Now, he went onto my list for a future podcast. I don't remember who I was looking for in the Belmont section a few weeks ago, but I stumbled almost literally on a stone with the name Robert C. the Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys Eskens. I was excited to have yet another subject for the podcast about titled individuals. Now I've got enough to do 2 podcasts. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information about these 2 men, just a handful of newspaper articles that are scattered throughout the years and across the country. For instance, the hunt for the Marquis begins with a new article from the Washington Evening Star dated January 29, 1880. Quote, "The latest sensation in the way of betrothals in Paris is that of Mrs. Stephen Dana of Philadelphia to M. Roberto Carles Eskens of Brussels. Mrs. Dana is the widow of the late Stephen Dana of Philadelphia and sister of Mr. George B. Roberts of Pennsylvania Railroad fame. She is also the sister of Countess Galley of Paris. The groom-elect is a Belgian. They met at the Hotel Continental last September. The marriage is to take place in Paris within 2 weeks." Mrs. Stephen Dana was Mary Warner Roberts, 1835-1915. They're the family that lived in Pencoed Mansion, made their fortune through the Pennsylvania Railroad. Her first husband, Stephen W. Dana, was an influential Bostonian. He was the brother of artist Paul Dana, a relative of the author Richard H. Dana, 2 years before the mast. He was also a member of the Latrobe family. He had died suddenly in 1883, despite being cared for by Dr. David Hayes Agnew. Mary's brother Howard Roberts was an artist, and one of her sisters was a dollar princess, the Countess Galley. July 11th, 1895 edition of the Times of Philadelphia had a social note. A very notable array of Philadelphians sailed on the steamship Paris, including Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys and Marquise de Frenoys, his wife, who have been spending some time at the Bryn Mawr Hotel. Several other names are also listed. Now, sometime in the prior 5 years, Roberto Eskens had become Marquis de Frenoys. I can find a French commune named Frenois, Frenois, in northeastern France, but nothing that resembles the name Frenoys, Frenoys, in Belgium. You may also recall that the Bryn Mawr Hotel, located just off Montgomery Avenue, was designed by Frank Furness. It was built in 1890-1891. Now it serves as the Baldwin School. More than 30 years later, in the Philadelphia Evening Public Ledger on March 18, 1916, there's an article with the headline, "Marquis called fake by Paris paper found living at Bellevue. Declares he's a Belgian nobleman and says exposure is positively absurd. Wedded local woman." Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys, or Marquise de Frenoys, who, according to an article published in the Renaissance, a Paris journal, is an impostor and a German of no title and doubtful history instead of a Belgian nobleman, was found in this city today at the Bellevue Stratford. Before the war, the man was known all over Paris, and especially in theatrical and financial worlds. Sometime before the war, he came to Philadelphia, and for more than a year, he's been occupying a suite of 2 rooms on the 12th floor of the Bellevue Stratford, where he was found today. The Renaissance charges that his name is really Franz Eskens, that he was born in Prussia, from where he was forced to flee, leaving a baby girl, that he came to America, where he worked as a butler and a valet to a wealthy family, and that he later married a widow much older than himself. The Marquis was found as he was leaving his suite, rooms 1226 and 1227. When confronted with the charges contained in the Renaissance, he waved them aside, exclaiming, "Absurd, positively so, absolutely ridiculous to permit of discussion." "Who was your father?" he was asked. "My father was the Marquis Gaston." "Was he a Belgian nobleman?" "He was," said the Marquis briskly. "I really don't intend to go into this thing. Town Topics carried a similar article some time ago, and I simply ignored it." The Marquis, which is in quotation marks, appears to be about 60 years old, is of medium height, and rather stout. He has gray side whiskers. Today he was wearing a black derby, a conservative dark suit, and a long overcoat with a lambskin collar. The coat is given a military aspect by several large frogs of black braid down the front. The Renaissance charges that the first wife of the Marquis died in misery after he had left her. Before her death, she is said to have become a vegetable seller on the streets. The Marquis, according to the records here, married a daughter of Edward Roberts. She died at the Bellevue Stratford on March 28, 1915, at the age of 80. According to the records of the undertaker, B.R. Bringhurst, the woman was suffering from purulent cystitis combined with old age. She was buried from the Bellevue Stratford on May 31st. Burial was in West Laurel Hill Cemetery. Her name was given as Mary Roberts de Frenoys. She was related to Mrs. Howard Roberts of 215 South 16th Street. In Paris, according to the Renaissance, the Marquis maintained a fine establishment on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, one of the finest and most aristocratic thoroughfares in the city. He subscribed $40,000 to the expense of producing Parsifal at the Opera House in Paris, and this was taken, if further indication were needed, that he was a man of tremendous resources. He disappeared after the beginning of the war. I know you're curious. I did the math. $40,000 in 1915 would be worth $1.25 million today. Mary W. Eskens' last will. She mentions, quote, that my husband and I have been for some years past living in Paris, France, but we have abandoned our former residence and taken up permanent domicile in the city of Philadelphia. The third codicil of her will stated, I give and bequeath unto my beloved husband, Roberto C. Eskens, the Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys, the sum of $200,000. A lot of ground with the tenement thereon erected, known and numbered as 2125 Walnut Street. Whoa! What is the value of a 5-story building at 2125 Walnut Street? Wow! That is right on Rittenhouse Square. 2 weeks later, April 6, 1916, there were 2 brief articles in the Boston Globe under the headline, Marquis' property is sequestrated by France. A dateline, Paris. The property of the Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys, who is said by the government to be Franz Esken, a German subject, and who left Paris at the time of the mobilization, has been sequestrated. He is now in Philadelphia. The Marquis married an American woman who died in Philadelphia in May 1915. Now, sequestrate and sequester are similar. They had different legal meanings. I had to look this up. Sequester, of course, means to isolate or set apart. Sequestrate means to legally take possession of property. The second story, same day, but the dateline of Philadelphia. The Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys, who has been in this city for several weeks, characterized as nonsense the report from Paris that he is a German subject. He declared that he is a native of Belgium and always has been and still is a loyal subject of King Albert. He said that he heard his property in France had been sequestrated by the government, but that it was of so little value he'd given the matter only passing notice. My property in France is valued at less than $5,000, so why should I worry about it? As for the report that I'm a German subject, that's all nonsense. Marquis de Frenoys, who is stopping at a hotel here, declined to discuss the matter further and refused to state the nature of his business in Philadelphia. When Eskens died in 1923, there was no mention in any newspaper that I could find. He was quietly laid to rest under a table stone in the Belmont section of Laurel Hill West. I could not determine from the newspapers and other material online whether his title of Marquis was genuine or bogus, but that is what's on his grave marker. As for the name Frenoys, the closest I could find with a title, of course, is the Frenoys. I mentioned them earlier. Remember Ruth Sylvia Roach, Baroness Frenoy. She was a friend and confidant of Queen Elizabeth II, maternal grandmother of Diana, the Princess of Wales. If Roberto made his title up, he quietly got away with it for more than a third of a century. November 6, 1924, the estate of Roberto C. Eskens was adjudicated and showed a balance of $509,372, and the property at 2125 Walnut Street went to Ethel Roberts. My other questionable nobleman had an obituary in the Atlantic Constitution on Sunday, January 23, 1977. This is a good one. Memorial service for Baron James Ivan Michael von Suttka, 71, of 2514 Piedmont Road, Marietta, will be at 3 p.m. Tuesday in the chapel of Glen Memorial United Methodist Church, with Dr. Larry Bauman officiating. Baron von Suttka, a member of the House of Habsburg, died Thursday. He was 3 times Olympic champion in pistol shooting and had retired after 20 years' service in the U.S. Marine Corps. He subsequently served 10 years as a building estimator at Dobbins Air Force Base. At an early age, Baron von Suttka defeated King Alfonso of Spain in a shooting match. The king was a noted marksman who had not been beaten in 60 years. Survivors include the widow, Mrs. Patience Holman von Suttka. Contributions may be made to Emory University. The obituary did not mention that he was born in Canton, Ohio, to a German immigrant, or that he had outlived his son. From the Atlanta Constitution, Friday, July 9, 1971. Memorial services for Mr. Burr Holman Sharp von Suttka, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ivan von Suttka of Marietta, will be held in Durham Chapel, Emory University Hospital, at 8 p.m. Friday, July 9th. In lieu of flowers, the family suggests donations to Metropolitan Atlanta Council on Alcoholism and Drugs, room 216, 501 Pulliam Street, Southwest Atlanta, 30312. Burr was 19 when he died. He had been in trouble with the law for a while. In 1968, the Long Beach, California Independent reported, a jailed teenager squirmed up an air vent to freedom Monday after he was placed in a drunk tank at Long Beach Juvenile Hall for bad behavior in his cell. Burr Holman von Suttka, 17, a transient booked on suspicion of burglary and grand theft auto, was aided in his escape by a malfunctioning alarm system on a cell block outer door. Officers said the barefoot von Suttka began his escape from the 4th floor of the public safety building by leaping up and ripping the cover off a 1-foot diameter vent in the drunk tank's ceiling. After hiding the cover behind a bench, he pulled himself inside and wheeled to a storage area, police said. Burr was the first name to be placed on the Laurel Hill East sarcophagus. It has 3 names on it. Burr H.S. von Suttka, 1951-1971, Baron J. Ivan M. von Suttka, 1907-1977, and Patience Burr H. von Suttka, no dates. The name von Suttka with 2 T's is an unusual one. Other than this family, I saw it only rarely in early newspapers. On the Find a Grave website, which covers billions, literally billions of grave sites around the world, if you put in the name Suttka, it only brings up 7 names, and one of them is our Michael. If you put in von Suttka, it only brings up 1 name, and that's Michael. Newspapers.com is not much better. Well, let's check what this obituary said. There's a claim. He was an Olympic medalist in pistol shooting 3 times. Fact-checking something like that in 1977 was tedious. He probably would have had to go to the library. Needless to say, it took me less than 2 minutes to show that in the Olympic Games between 1924, when Michael would have been 17, and 1956, when he would have been 59, the only Olympic pistol shooting events were the 50-meter and the 25-meter, sometimes 25-meter rapid fire. The name Suttka is nowhere to be found. In fact, Americans only medaled in 1924 and 1948. Well, how about the Marine Corps? Believe it or not, I found a 1961 book online called The History of Marine Corps Competitive Marksmanship. It's by Major Robert E. Bard. The name M. Suttka appears twice, both times for 1933 rifle competition. The Spanish king mentioned in the obituary is Alfonso XIII, who served from 1886 to 1931. Although he was born Alfonso León Fernando María Santiago Isidro Pascual Antoine de Borbón y de Habsburgo-Lorena, he was a House of Bourbon rather than the House of Habsburg. His Wikipedia entry, despite being quite extensive, makes no mention at all of his skill with a pistol. But I did a little further digging. In November of 2014, Christie's Auction House in London announced a sale of sporting and military firearms, which included a large selection of rare firearms from the King's collection. Quote, King Alfonso XIII was an extremely accomplished shot who hunted throughout Europe in the company of fellow monarchs and heads of state. The broad range of the firearms in the collection includes acquisitions from his trips and bears testament to his patronage of the finest makers of the time. The Spanish king was a champion live pigeon shot. Maybe, just maybe, the House of Habsburg, except that dates to the 11th century. Its reigns included the Holy Roman Empire from 1440 to 1806. Literally dozens of kings and other noblemen can claim the House of Habsburg, so tracing Michael through that string is nearly impossible. We do know that Michael von Suttka married Patience Holman, a mainline socialite who was a fine equestrian. She'd broken her back in a 1938 jumping competition that made the newspapers. Patience's father was William K. Holman, owner of the largest Bible publisher in the world. He's buried at Laurel Hill East in Section J. I was able to confirm that Michael did spend some time in the U.S. Marine Corps. I cannot confirm a 20-year career. After Michael's death in 1977, Patience took up with a sales executive named George Lacey Smith, and when he died in 1994, Patience was listed as his companion. Then there's the odd story that's reported in the Atlanta Constitution on April 23, 2005. An elderly woman says she still suffers injuries from a bizarre attack on her Alpharetta home by an Orkin pest control worker who allegedly tried to poison and rape other women. Patience von Suttka 88 filed a lawsuit Thursday in Fulton County Superior Court against Orkin Incorporated and its former employee, suspect Antonio D. Battle, 31. Von Suttka, who has used another pest control company, assumed that the company had sent over a new bug man on March 24, 2004, when Battle showed up with his equipment. She didn't see the Orkin truck parked in her driveway. Once inside, she said Battle became violent after she questioned the higher-than-normal fee before paying him. She said he threw her walker across the room and pounced. He shoved my shoulders back and began to spray me and pin my legs back and leaned against them, she said. I'm hitting him and beating him, and he's spraying me. Von Suttka said the stranger shoved the nozzle of the pesticide sprayer down her throat and sprayed. I bit him 3 times. The 3rd time, I really hung on. Von Suttka was able to call 911. The police quickly swarmed in and found Battle standing in her garage. Patients testified in court against Battle. He came right at me, pushed me into a chair, beat me up with a can of bug spray. He got the nozzle in my mouth and down my throat before I could stop him. I spat up blood for a week afterwards. Battle was found guilty on numerous charges: aggravated assault, robbery, sexual battery. Patience Holman von Suttka died July 7, 2008, at age 91 in Alpharetta, Georgia. She had arranged for her body to be donated to Emory University School of Medicine. That means that beautiful sarcophagus at Laurel Hill East is a cenotaph for Baron von Suttka, Patience Holman von Suttka, and Baron James Ivan Michael von Suttka, who apparently wasn't a real baron, and who definitely wasn't a 3-time Olympic gold medalist. June is a busy, busy month at Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West. You still have time today. If you downloaded this early, you still have time today to catch a couple of things at Laurel Hill. The last day of the Philadelphia Death and Arts Festival is coming up on Sunday, June 1st, which is today. Like I say, if you download the show today, you can get tickets online. There will be some reflection spaces, including a festival altar, a mandala, places to grab a snack, opportunities to connect with death professionals, to ask practical questions. And Sunday morning, me, Dr. Joe Lex, retired emergency physician and medical school professor, will be giving a medical tour at Laurel Hill West, Medical Meanderings. Sunday, June 1st, 10 a.m. until noon. I am going to show you a surgeon whose nickname was the Great Slasher, and a husband and wife doctor team who consulted on the Radium Girls. I will show you 2 men summoned to Washington, D.C. when a president was ill. Talk about a 3rd one, and many, many more. That is Sunday, June 1st. Probably too late, but I hope you would be able to catch it. If not, put it on your calendar for next year. I plan to do this one for the next couple of years. June 7th, Saturday, it's time for Divine Hand Ensemble at Laurel Hill East, the 14th annual concert in the cemetery. Mano Divinas, Theremin music, Divine Hand Ensemble, walking tour, lots of fun. 6:30 to 9 o'clock, Saturday, June 7th, Laurel Hill East. Earlier on June 7th at 10 in the morning for Pride Month, it's Out of the Closet and Into the Crypt. Pat Rose is doing this tour at East on Saturday the 7th at 10 a.m. She also does one at West, I'll tell you about in a few minutes. It's a relatively new tour. This obviously, most of these people died at a time when it was, not only was it unsafe to be out, it was probably illegal to be out. You certainly didn't read things like sexual orientation in somebody's obituary or in cemetery records. And we have quite a few people who are easily identified as LGBTQ+. So come on out and learn about them on June 7th. The next day, Sunday, June 8th, 10 a.m. at Laurel Hill East. It's the husband and wife duo of Patty and Tom Stringer doing Henry VIII, Not the King, 8 Henrys of Laurel Hill. 8 men named Henry and 2 Henriettas. As Patty says, it's a tour fit for a king. That ought to be fun. A general, a spiritualist, a historian, a gunsmith, amateur dentist, poet, doctor, lawyer, and industrialist. Cinema in the Cemetery is Friday the 13th. How appropriate, an Eraserhead. This was arranged before David Lynch died. This is going to turn into a David Lynch tribute, however, the movie. And if you come on a tour West Laurel Hill with me, remind me, and I will show you the David Lynch, what I consider the David Lynch tribute at Laurel Hill West. It's in the Edwin Forrest plot. I've mentioned before that Edwin Forrest bought a plot for retired actors and actresses who did not have funds to buy their own burial plots. So there are a lot of actors and actresses buried in this one plot, and the top name on the back of that stone is Laura Palmer. Anyway, come see Eraserhead, Friday the 13th, 7 p.m., Laurel Hill East. I've got a co-tour with Sarah Hamill on Saturday, June 14th, the day before Father's Day. This Sporting Life. And Sarah and I are going to lead you around the cemetery. This is a long walk. This is 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Laurel Hill West. Hall of Fame members, 2 for baseball, 2 for tennis, 2 for skiing and snowboarding, hockey, college football, golf, the man who invented progressive resistance, weightlifting, the first woman to drive a golf ball more than 300 yards. It's a fun tour. You'll have a lot of fun with that. Come join Sarah and me Saturday. If you're up for it, you can head over to Laurel Hill East in the morning. I'm sorry I'm doing these out of order during the day. But June 14th, 10 a.m. at Laurel Hill East, there's a Hot Spots and Storied Plots tour, and that will be by Laura Lewis. Hard to pass up. You're going to have to go on 2 tours that day. You have to go to East in the morning and then come over to West in the afternoon. Back to LGBTQ plus month for Laurel Hill West, Queerly Departed, Saturday the 21st at 10 a.m., Laurel Hill West. Again, that's Hat Rose. And then that afternoon at Laurel Hill East, June 21st, 3 p.m., Nurture with Nature. This is an immersive experience. You can learn the art of collecting, wrapping, drying, and properly fumigating natural materials. Various smoking blends. Therapeutic horticulture practitioner and mixed media artist Kate Irvine. That sounds like it might be fun. Stop the Presses, printers and publishers, Sunday, June 22nd, 10 a.m. until noon, Laurel Hill East, and that is Peter Howell. Boneyard Bookworms, the June discussion is Thursday, June 26th, 2025 at 6 p.m. The book is The Garden Against Time, In Search of a Common Paradise by Olivia Ling. Hotspots and Storied Plots, Friday, June 27th, 10 a.m. until noon. Laurel Hill East, David Schwarzkopf. Victorian Spirit Crawl. Here comes your evening tour at the cemetery for June. It's on Friday, June 27th, from 7 p.m. until 10 p.m. This usually works in 15-minute increments. People take off with a new group every 15 minutes. Well, actually less than that, probably more like every 5 or 10 minutes. I usually take the last tour of the night in case there's anybody who shows up in a wheelchair or some sort of wheeled conveyance, and then I can take them on a limited mobility tour. strictly on the paved paths. But if everybody is temporarily able-bodied, then we will wander off the paths also. Anyway, I'll be one of the guides at that on Friday, June 27th. Next day, June 28th, Sacred Spaces and Storied Places at Laurel Hill West. And Jen Kravenskis will be your tour guide for that. I told you that June was busy. Look at this. And then there's one more, Magnificent Monuments, on Sunday, June 29th, 10 a.m. until noon. At Laurel Hill East, Mary Ellen Moran, she will tell you about all of the sculpture. Oh, I do hope Old Mortality is visible again by then. Old Mortality's been hidden for a couple of weeks, undergoing some rehab. I hope by the end of June it will be back on proud display. But Mary Ellen will tell you all about funerary art. That's a lot. You got a lot of stuff coming up in June. Please join us for at least a couple of these wonderful, wonderful tours, then become a member of the Friends of Laurel Hill Cemetery. Okay, let us get back to the podcast. Clarence Wiener, 1878-1932, giving Baron Munchausen some competition. There's nothing particularly special about the family plot. It's next to the Potter Van Uxem plot, Sexum J, Laurel Hill East. Wiener is on the base of the obelisk. Modest obelisk, maybe 15 feet, maybe 12 feet tall. There are several cradle graves and smaller markers that surround it. Low concrete curb surrounds the graves. It delineates the plot. This was back during the plague, when I was looking for new people to investigate. So I did my usual thing. I took pictures of the family marker, all the other markers in the plot, and I came back to my office. I went to the online records from Laurel Hill Cemetery to find out who was buried there. 12 adults. 10 were named Wiener, 2 named Du Bois. The patriarch I found was Heinrich Wiener, 1807-1875. He was a businessman, had a shop at the southeast corner of 9th and Arch, what they called the site of the old Cadwallader mansion. He did well. He left about $8 million to his wife, Eliza Anderson Wiener, 1821-1894, and his children. His son Louis, Lewis, which is misspelled in the online database as Louis, Louis, lived from 1838 to 1893. He married Eugenia Catherine Ketterlinus, 1845 to 1908. She was the daughter of the famed lithographer John Louis Ketterlinus, who is buried in the Ashland section at Laurel Hill West. He is in the Ring Mausoleum in Ashland. It was John Louis Ketterlinus who introduced and perfected color lithography in the 1870s. While I was going through this information, one person was missing a grave marker. There was a record for a guy named Clarence Wiener, but there was no grave marker. Well, first thing I did was go to the archives to confirm that indeed Clarence Wiener was buried in that plot. And that made me wonder why everybody else had a marker and he didn't. All right, take a deep breath. Here we go. Clarence Wiener was born on April 10th, 1878. This is from his 1916 Who's Who entry. Military expert and writer, traveler, inventor. Born Philadelphia, 1878, son of Louis Wiener and Eugenia Ketterlinus of Philadelphia, USA. Unmarried, educated Andover Academy, Harvard University. Aide-de-camp to General Frederick Grant in Spanish-American War, 1898. Correspondent New York Sun in South Africa. Subsequently, senior captain and second-in-command Driscoll's Scouts, dispatches twice and 8 times wounded. Chairman of Wiener News Agency Limited, XL Electric Company Limited, Oldings Limited, Wiener Advertising Company, Daily Events Company, Ideal Furniture Company Limited, Several years Continental Representative Colt's Gun and Carriage Company, president of Hampton's Magazine. In 1914, appointed accredited war correspondent of Reuters Telegram Company Limited and the Press Association. Invented a number of military and electrical appliances. Publications, articles in the Fortnightly, Illustrated London News, Land and Water, etc., and many others in the USA and elsewhere. Recreations, polo, tennis, hunting, shooting, landscape architecture, sailing, traveling, dog breeding. Address, Ewell Castle, Surrey, 15 Sloane Street, Southwest. Take a deep breath. That is a lot to unpack there. Clarence's father, Edward, had died when he was 16. Now, it's true, he went to Harvard for 1 year. He did not graduate. He attended 1896, 1897, and what everybody remembers him for is his collection of taxidermized wildlife in his dormitory room. And after a student celebration one night, he roused his fellow residents of Dunster Hall by peppering his stuffed lion with a repeating rifle. Although he only spent that year at Harvard, he annually wrote back to his class of 1900 to keep them apprised of his exploits. Here we go again. In 1897, in November, I went to Cuba. In 1898, in August, I went to Puerto Rico as first lieutenant and aide-de-camp on General F.D. Grant's staff. That's Frederick Dent Grant, Ulysses' son. In 1899, in November, I went to South Africa as a correspondent for the New York Sun. Appointed by Chamberlain of the London office, I went to Natal, Second Boer War, with General Sir Redvers Henry Buller, then to Cyphergat with General Sir William Forbes Gattaker. At Stormberg, a major defeat, I led back the remaining 18 scouts of Captain Raymond Harvey Lodge Joseph de Montmorency's VC Scouts. I drew the Stormberg position a few days after the disaster and returned the next night. Gattaker managed to get through the Stormberg position from this drawing. I was offered 8 commissions in the next few days. I decided to organize a corps of scouts with Major Daniel Patrick Driscoll and was placed second in command of this corps, Driscoll Scouts. I was 8 times wounded and in January 1901 had an independent command of 347 men. Holy cow. Because of later events during the Great War, these claims were evaluated by the British War Office in 1916, who determined it's true that he served as a lieutenant in Driscoll Scouts in the South African War, and he was granted the South Africa Medal with 4 clasps. But his services were dispensed with for intemperance on 2 November 1900. He was described by General Brabant as a brave officer who behaved well, but there is no trace of his ever having been mentioned in dispatches or wounded 8 times before November 1900, especially as he went to South Africa originally apparently as a correspondent for the New York Sun. He was never entitled to call himself captain, and if he was ever second in command of Driscoll Scouts, it must have been for a very short period. So, we find that Clarence Wiener liked to stretch the truth. Think of him as a cross between Baron von Munchausen and Walter Mitty. Hieronymus Karl Friedrich von Munchausen, 1720-1797. This was a real person. He fought for the Russian Empire during the Russo-Turkish War of 1735-1739. He retired in 1760 and developed a reputation for telling outrageous tall tales based on his military career. Now, these tales were adapted by writer Rudolf Erich Raspe into the fictional Baron Munchausen, a larger-than-life hero who would ride cannonballs, he'd wrestle a 40-foot alligator, he'd travel to the moon, and then he'd tell about all of these marvelous adventures in the first person. He bargained with wolves. He was swallowed by a giant fish. Once when his horse was cut in half accidentally, he used laurel tree branches to fix the horse. There is actually a statue of Munchausen riding the front half of a horse in Bodenwerder, Germany. Once he claims to have saved himself from drowning by pulling himself out of the water with his own hair. Since 1951, there's been a medical term called Munchausen syndrome. It's used to describe traveling patients with complex, factitious disorders. This has since been expanded to include Munchausen by proxy, in which the illness is feigned by caretakers rather than a patient, and even more recently Munchausen by internet, by which illness is feigned online, the GoFundMe campaign for the young person with the cancer that doesn't exist. Now, the Baron is frequently portrayed on stage and on the silver screen. Recently, in my life anyway, Terry Gilliam of Monty Python did his film version in 1988 with John Neville, Eric Idle, Uma Thurman, Jonathan Pryce, and many, many others. All medical personnel know or have heard about Munchausen syndrome. It is incredibly rare to actually see a Munchausen patient. I worked emergency departments in the Philadelphia area for 30 years. During that time, I worked, I'm going to say, a half a dozen different emergency departments. I can count on one hand the number of true patients with Munchausen's that I cared for. In fact, if you had to pin me down, there were only two that I could guarantee you were Munchausen, because I saw them at emergency departments separated by 30 miles. I saw them years apart, and yet they would show up with exactly the same complaint and the same thick folder of their medical workup. Let's get back to Clarence. 1898, Clarence had an article published in the December issue of North American Review. It was called Financial Wrong in Puerto Rico. He was in good company. This same issue of North American Review had an article by Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, progressive and public intellectual Reverend Lyman Abbott, and British Lieutenant Winston Spencer Churchill. In September 1899, Clarence's mother, Eugenia, widowed in 1893, married Baron Louis Ludwig Amadeus von Graetner at Stratford-on-Avon in England. The ceremony was performed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The announcement noted, quote, "She is several years the senior of her husband." Well, Eugenia was 55, Clarence was 21, and his new stepfather was 32. The families had known each other for many years, and Baron von Graetner was born in Philadelphia to Carl von Graetner, a pianist well known for, quote, "inculcating the rudiments of that instrument into the minds of many of the little Quakeresses of the smart set," end quote. When the Catalinus family was approached about details of the wedding by local newspapers, they pleaded ignorance. They had no knowledge of the ceremony. Clarence was on a boat on his way to South Africa, and he missed the wedding. The newlyweds vacationed in Europe and made no plans to return to the United States. January 1900, we next hear from Clarence. He's living at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. The newspapers called him a law student and explained that he was being sued for services rendered by Eugene Gilmore as his tutor. Gilmore tutored Wiener at or near Boston for $3 a lesson for 82 lessons. An affidavit sets forth that when someone showed up at the hotel to serve a summons and set his card to Clarence's room, the card was returned with "not at home" written across it. This occurred several times. Eventually, Clarence was served with a subpoena and forced to pay. Oh, here's more from Clarence's report to his Harvard classmates. "I returned to England in the fall of 1901. I had 36 polo ponies in Rome, where I started polo. In the spring of 1904, I drove tandem and 3 extra horses 2,000 miles through Europe from Rome. In the spring of 1905, I drove tandem and 3 extra saddle horses from Rome through Simplon to Geneva, Aix-les-Bains, Geneva, Lucerne, Prague, Dresden, Cologne, Linz, and Vienna. In all, 6,200 miles in 4 3/4 months. 1904, guess who comes back to Philadelphia? Clarence. He pops up unannounced in Philadelphia. He'd been away for 5 years. He just showed up at his mother's apartments at the Bellevue, Stratford. Now he was wearing the bars of a Captain Wiener. A newspaper article points out that his stepfather had been preparing to go to war, but was prevented by a serious accident from doing so. It also points out that Mr. Wiener was not given to letter writing. Eugenia, the Countess, died in 1907, and she is interred at Laurel Hill's family plot, the Wiener family plot I described at the beginning. Almost immediately, Clarence sued his stepfather for forging his mother's name to embezzle inheritance money. November 7th, 1907, Philadelphia Inquirer had a field day with the Baron's testimony. "I certainly cannot understand why I should have been arrested," said the violinist, romantically smoothing back his luxuriant head of hair. "I am sure," he added, with an effective little catch in his melodious voice, "that I never profited 1 cent by my marriage to Mrs. Wiener. In fact, I was the loser by the transaction. But let us speak no more of my wife. It pains me very much. I repeat, however, that in everything I did, I acted through a sense of honor." The jury of 12 men found him not guilty. Clarence was not able to testify. He was in Austria, quote, consulting with officials there with regard to a cannon that he had patented. This is again from Clarence's autobiographical sketch to Harvard. He said, "From 1905 to 1908, I was engaged in Vienna in perfecting an electric self-player piano I had invented. Also, I held machine gun trials in Austria as the continental representative of the Colt Gun and Carriage Company. And at the same time, I became president of the Broadway magazine, renamed Hampton's Magazine in 1908. In the spring of 1908, I had a houseboat 100 by 19 feet, finished after 2 years building on the Danube. We started from Vienna on June 5th and were tugged by special steamer through Hungary and Serbia to Târnu Severin in Romania and returned in the same way to Vienna in October 1908. In October 27th, I had a fatal motor accident near Traunstein in Bavaria. The chauffeur and a friend were killed." Yeah, the auto accident. This made headlines both in Europe and in the United States. The friend that was reported killed was one of the infamous Barrison sisters. They were from a risque vaudeville act which performed in the United States and Europe from about 1893 to 1897. In the United States, they were advertised as the wickedest girls in the world. 5 blonde, curly-headed siblings were said to sing in high, squeaky voices and dance with middling ability. They achieved notoriety, however, by ingenious use of double entendre on stage. They asked the men in the crowd if they wished to see certain parts of their anatomy that were named for a cat, and then they ended their act by flipping up the fronts of their dresses only to reveal an underdress with a crucially placed pocket that held a live kitten. Rumors flew that Clarence and the dead sister, now known as Mademoiselle Bettine, were driving to London to be wed, but she was still married to a rich Chilean whom she had not yet divorced. And it turns out it was a case of false identity. It was not one of the Barrison sisters, who was killed in the crash, although she probably was having an affair with Clarence at that time. Back to Clarence and his reports to his buddies at Harvard. May 1909, I started the Wiener News Agency Limited at 64 Strand, London. It is now the largest news agency in England. We have 28 newspapers in America, 21 in England, and 1 in South Africa, and 10 in Australasia. I write for the North American Review, Edinburgh Review, Fortnightly, and other magazines and reviews in both countries. Since 1910, I have spent a great deal of my time and money in the endeavor to promote a better understanding between the peoples of the United States and those of the British Empire. But a few weeks before the inception of hostilities in the Great Worldwide War, I closed down the news end of my agency as pecuniary losses were becoming altogether too severe. During the above time, I have been chairman of the following companies: Oldings Limited, printers; the XL Electric Company, Limited; Daily Events, Limited; Wiener Photo Company, Limited; Wiener Advertising Agency, Limited; the Here Furnishing and Decorating Company, Limited; and Wiener Literary Agency, Limited. In 1907, Clarence purchased Ewell Castle in Epsom and made it his home for the next several years. For a while, his was the only castle in England that flew both the Stars and Stripes and the Union Jack. He flew them side by side. Now, Ewell Castle had been built in 1814 for Thomas Calverley and passed on to the Gaddison family in 1842. Clarence was the third owner. He purchased it for £11,000. He spent a huge amount of money developing a Japanese garden, which is still considered the finest Japanese garden in the London area. But his activities in the castle raised suspicions of the townspeople. He motored to town daily. He had many lady visitors at the castle. On one occasion, he charged a lady who had been staying with him at the castle of stealing jewelry. On another occasion, he was accused of procuring girls for immoral purposes. October 1914, Clarence made headlines across the country due to his Mustenberg affair. Professor Hugo Mustenberg, noted Harvard professor and exchange professor at Berlin, had brought out a book and written several articles since the war began that defended Germany and the Kaiser and denounced England, France, and Russia as being to blame for the war. He was recognized as the most outspoken of the many German Americans who defended their fatherland. The United States did not enter the war until April 6, 1917, remember. Clarence immediately fired off a telegram, and he threatened to cancel his bequest of $10 million to Harvard if Professor Munsterberg was not released from the faculty for, quote, unwarranted pro-German utterances, end quote. Philadelphia newspapers went at once to Uncle John Ketterlinus, who still had his lithography firm at 4th and Arch. That's just like Clarence. Clarence has made some money, but he's had several ups and downs. I couldn't swear that he has more than 2 cents. The article also identified Clarence as commanding a brigade of British artillery in France. Mustenberg offered his resignation. Harvard declined, and everything seemed to settle down very quickly. Then during the war, the Evening News published an article that suggested a concrete-bottomed lake in the Japanese garden of Ewell Castle was capable of mounting 5 heavy guns to command the main railway line to London. They identified the owner of the property as Captain Clarence Wiener, a naturalized American born in Austria, who had commissioned the lake early in 1914. The newspaper claimed that Wiener was a spy, since he owned an 80-horsepower car equipped with a 500-candle-power acetylene searchlight. Wiener was incensed. He sued for libel. He even went so far as to instruct the celebrated barrister Edward Marshall Hall to clear his name. And at trial, in April 1917, evidence was given that the concrete had been laid down by a landscape gardener to prevent the water from escaping the lake. A local doctor also asserted he had never known Wiener to display any pro-German tendency. However, Wiener fought answering potential embarrassing questions relating to his private life and was censured by the judge for writing threatening letters to his former butler. Clarence scored a Pyrrhic victory. Damages of just £75 were awarded against the newspaper. What did Clarence have to say about his contribution to the Great War? From another letter to Harvard. From 1914 until 1916, I was offered 3 commands of British battalions by general officers who knew of my work in South Africa, and also a Corps staff appointment with rank of colonel. The British War Office refused to sanction any of these appointments, as I refused to take the oath of allegiance to an alien ruler, something that was not demanded, or indeed even mentioned, when I took a field appointment against the Boers. Naturally, having spent much of my life in obtaining first-hand knowledge and experience of the military doctrines, organizations, etc. in Europe, I was nearly heartbroken to hear of my pals going under and myself unable to take an active part in the great adventure. Yet right up to the day our own dear country came in, I did not cease from my efforts to aid in several ways the Entente powers. But my real place was in the lines. The day the United States declared war, I cabled Adjutant General McCain that if I received the necessary authority, I would raise, equip, and train at my own expense a unit in England and in Italy to be known as the American Legion. The purpose of this was to cause a wave of patriotism to sweep our country, and thus to silence all further efforts of the pacifists and bookworms to retard military and naval efforts and endeavors. For I was persuaded that by recruiting this unit from intelligent compatriots, most of whom already had either militia training or were accustomed to the use of a rifle, we would be ready for the combat lines within 4 months, September 1st, by speeding up intensive battle training and marksmanship. It would now be beside the point to dilate on the benefit to the country had such a force been actually in the lines at that time. And what did the British War Office have to say about this? Now, on the whole, Wiener appears to be a man whose main idea is self-advertisement, but without sufficient capacity to secure his object. There's every reason to believe him a liar and a libertine, but there's none to regard him as a danger to the safety of the realm. 1917, Clarence Wiener put Ewell Castle on the market and moved back to the United States. It changed hands a few more times, and then it became the Ewell Castle Boarding School in 1926. They celebrate their centennial next year. Among its famed graduates are jockey and author Dick Francis, actor Oliver Reed, Grammy-nominated record producer Tim Palmer, and many others. Now, along the way, Clarence had collected some archaeological artifacts. He donated some of them to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, including the marble face of a cherub, which dates from Roman times. He allegedly found it at Ewell. Wiener burned through a fortune, up to $8 million. He spent until the money ran out. In 1919, he left the Waldorf Astoria in New York, did not pay the bill, and he checked into the Hotel Imperial. There on the 15th of December, he attempted suicide by shooting himself just below the heart. He left a suicide note on the stationery of the Wiener Advertising Agency, 64 Strand, London. He was discovered by a boy who delivered laundry to his suite. Now, according to his own account, he was in debt for just $600. He had appealed to Uncle John Ketterlinus for assistance, but had been turned down. He decided to kill himself. He missed. The shot was not fatal. He would recover. And then to add insult to injury, he was arrested in his hotel room on the 18th of December for violating the Sullivan Act because of illegal possession of a firearm. Now, after he recovered from this, he just disappeared from the news. I found nothing about him until November 1932. He registered at the Hotel Taft in New York City on the 11th of November as Colonel Wiener of Philadelphia. 11 days later, on November 22nd, he took a sash cord down from the window, wrapped it around his neck, and he hanged himself from a hook in the closet of his room on the 7th floor. He left a note that said, "Self-destruction, quote, is the only honorable thing left for me to do under the circumstances," end quote. He had been depending on a loan which did not materialize at the time of his suicide. His newspaper death notice acknowledged, although admittedly a student of military matters and the inventor of several ordnance improvements, Wiener's rank and military career were somewhat mysterious. In recent years, he'd been known as Colonel Wiener. Older newspaper clippings describing some of his exploits listed him as Captain and Major, but he was not listed in the Army Register. Clarence Leschinsky Wiener. He never used his middle name, which was Lesczynski, was interred in the family plot at Laurel Hill Cemetery on March 26, 1932, 4 days after he hanged himself. Now, despite the presence of 5 cradle graves, half a dozen other stones, that obelisk that I mentioned before, there is not one mention of Clarence Wiener in the plot. And I will tell you, for a man who loved publicity and self-promotion as much as he did, I have unsuccessfully been searching for a good photo of Clarence Wiener for the last 5 years. I found one fairly decent photo on a passport. Now, even if he wasn't a titled baron, his mother was a baroness, and she is buried in the plot, and Clarence Wiener was a man deserving of comparison to the legendary Baron von Munchausen. Princess Olga Demidov Trubetskoy Stover, 1895-1973. A princess with attitude. There's more than one mystery at Laurel Hill Cemetery. There are large plots with no stones, leaving us to wonder who's buried there. There are people who are worth millions of dollars who have a simple stone or no stone at all. Until last year, Hugh Craig and his sons had absolutely no stone. People who have universities named for them or reside in a simple family plot with a simple stone like Joseph Wharton. People who took the founding of our country to the grave with them, such as Charles Thompson. And another question, is that really Charles Thompson buried there, or is it one of the family servants? There's a long story behind that. And then there's the stone of Edward Royal Stover in Section T, lots 174, 175. The stone reads April 8, 1887, October 13, 1930. Archaeologist and engineer, Major Air Service, World War, married Olga Demidov, Princess Serge Trubetskoy, June 6, 1895, who hopes to lie here someday. Now, the family plot predates Edward's death by more than 50 years. The first burials in it were in November of 1875. And the 9 people buried there all have the last name of Stover. The most recent burial was 1933. So the name of Olga Demidov Trubetskoy Stover appears no place in the logbooks of Laurel Hill Cemetery. We can find traces of Olga in internet searches, but she completely disappears from the scene in 1941. I will trace her as best I can. Olga Demidov was born in 1895 to one of the Russian royal families, the Demidovs. They date back to the 1600s. She married into another Russian royal family, the Trubetskoys, in 1913, when she wed Prince Serge. His family dated back even further to the 1300s. They quickly had a son, also named Serge, but the family escaped from Russia to France in 1914, leaving both family fortunes behind. Apparently, there was another son. Now, this information comes from the 2001 obituary of Prince Serge Trubetskoy, who died in Staunton, Virginia, and who said he was the son of Sergei and Olga. There's an Olga Demidov in the Internet Movie Database about this time. She appeared in 10 movies between 1909 and 1919. Most of them were made in France. One of the movies, Jack, was made in 1913. It's actually available on YouTube. It's unlikely this is our Olga, although there's a resemblance between this actress and an older, stouter Olga from her later news clippings. Olga next appears in the Washington Post in November 1918, just before the end of the war. This article says, Olga Demidov, daughter of the former Paul Alexandrovich Demidov, one-time governor of Kiev, and widow of Prince Sergius Trubetskoy, who was killed in the early months of the present war, belongs to the non-princely branch of the House of Demidov. It is timely to explain this, since she was married last month in Paris to Major Edward Royal Stover, USA, who until the beginning of the present war was an employee of the Imperial Ottoman Bank at Smyrna. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania just 10 years ago and is the son of Mrs. William B. Stover of Wayne Avenue, Germantown, Philadelphia. Well, Edward had actually graduated from Princeton, not Penn, in 1908. He had immediately joined an archaeological expedition in Asia Minor, especially Turkey. In 1916, he went to Constantinople, now Istanbul, for the Rockefeller Foundation. He remained there until relations with this country were broken off in the spring of 1917. In 1920, he visited his brother in Philadelphia and delivered a talk as a member of the American Relief Administration. There is no mention of his family in any of these articles. Olga shows up in a January 24, 1923 article with a dateline of Paris. She was in the employ of a Madame Helen at 28 Rue Bray. It is slyly called a house of rendezvous. She had to testify in court. She explained that she had escaped from Russia in 1915. She met Major Edward R. Stover, a former Princeton man, now said to be a lawyer in Chicago. She went to France with him, she said, and they were married after Stover had joined the aviation forces. We separated in 1920. As my father, Prince Demendorf, and other members of the large family were gone, I was forced to seek other means of making a livelihood. It was then that I heard of Madame Helene's house, where poverty-stricken noble women were aided in finding rich husbands and protectors. 6 months afterward, Ned Hillsberg, a wealthy New Yorker, came to the house, and I met him and agreed to be his companion, provided he pay my fee of 1,000 francs a day, half of which went to Madame Helene. Hillsberg, a Broadway producer and a notorious big spender, had come to Paris in 1922, met the princess, and had fallen in love. From Olga's standpoint, this was a business proposition. Hillsberg produced a canceled check for 5,000 francs, which he said was the price of a fortnight's company. When she returned to Paris, Olga took $50,000 worth of jewelry, which she said was a gift from Hillsberg. The newspaper article notes that the princess is called one of the most beautiful women in Europe, She is a tall brunette, always exquisitely gowned, and was famous for her salons in St. Petersburg before the war. Well, let's see. She was born in 1895. The war started in 1914, so I don't think it's very likely that a 19-year-old Olga was hosting salons in Petersburg before the war. Edward died on October 13th, 1930, at the age of 43. Although he and Olga had been separated for at least 10 years, she is still listed as his surviving widow. Olga next appears on the horizon May 23, 1937, in New York City. Apparently during an argument in her third-floor apartment, she threw a wine bottle in anger at her jousting partner, and her partner ducked. The bottle went out the window. It struck a passerby who had just left a nearby bowling alley. It knocked him senseless and required a trip to the hospital. Olga was arrested and arraigned for felonious assault. But 2 days later in the courtroom, the victim was unable to identify her as the one who threw the bottle, and charges were dismissed. As Olga Trubetskoy made her exit from the court, she stuck her thumb to her nose and waggled her fingers at the judge in an air of defiance. The article notes that she had to lift her veil to do so. I have one last Olga sighting. It comes in 1941 when she was again arrested, this time on suspicion of running a brothel in New York City at 150 East 63rd Street. In late June, the police raided her apartment and found two distinguished gentlemen whom the judge instructed could only be referred to as Mr. X and Mr. Y to avoid international complications. However, the New York Daily News said that Mr. X bears a military title beginning with G in a country that gets bundles, and Mr. Y, who represents the free elements of a country that once gave us a statue to put in a harbor. Of the 4 young ladies present, 2 rapidly escaped. The others were described as a 23-year-old dancer in a Broadway musical comedy and, quote, a blonde charmer who lives at the Hotel Shelton, end quote. Reporters noted that the phone book lists the same number for Mrs. E.R. Stover, Princess Olga Trubetskoy, and Prince Serge Trubetskoy, whom she assured the police had been killed in the war. On her first appearance in court, Olga explained to reporters that the gathering in her apartment had been simply a reunion of World War spies over a case of champagne. She herself had been a spy for her native Russia then, she said. Finally, August 20th, 1941, Olga confessed that, quote, love had a commercial aspect in her duplex apartment, end quote. She explained that her 73-year-old mother, who was also a princess, had just arrived from Paris. Mother wouldn't understand, so I wanted to get this whole business out of the way. The poor lady is distraught enough as it is. She came here because she couldn't get enough milk for her cat. The Montgomery, Alabama Advertiser wins the prize for the least subtle headline while reporting this story. It was 3 words only: sacrifices for pussy. Of course, she tried to back out of her confession when she found out she'd probably served 6 months in the workhouse. She begged and she pleaded with the judge, saying her character had been without blemish for the 46 years of her life. The judge bought it, suspended her sentence September 3rd, 1941. 3 months later, in December 1941, 19 days after Pearl Harbor, Olga showed up at West Hartford, Connecticut for the marriage of her son, Prince Serge Trubetskoy, to Dorothy Livingston Ulrich. The bridegroom was at the time active duty military at Camp Stewart, Georgia. And after this, Olga disappears from the newspapers. I found Serge Trubetskoy's son on Facebook. He is the director of tourism in Petersburg, Virginia. I asked if I could talk with him about his grandmother. In particular, was she the Olga Demidov in silent movies? Did she raise her children? And if not, who did? Did Edward Stover still love her after the divorce? And if not, why was her name pre-carved on his tombstone? And where and when did she die? Now, initially, I had not heard back from him, but eventually he did come through, and he confirmed that the Olga in the movies was not our Olga, that she did raise her own children, that Edward Stover definitely still loved her, and she died on an island off of Spain. This was another amazing life. Russian royalty, acclaimed spy, Parisian female companion, jewel thief, assailant with a wine bottle, and madam of a high-class New York City brothel. Or was it just a reunion of spies? I think that Olga Demidov-Trebetsky-Stover is somebody who definitely belongs on this podcast, even though I talked about her once before, 5 years ago. For the mid-June episode of Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories number 45, Milton Cooper Work was one of the 6 original members of the Bridge Hall of Fame. He was recognized as world authority on whist, bridge whist, and contract bridge. He was Charles Gorin's instructor and boss for many years. For July's All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 76, it's a handful of eccentrics. Major Wakeman Gribble was a retired military man who grew increasingly paranoid as he grew older. This led him to shoot and kill a police officer who'd been sent to do a wellness check. Louis Gratz Fell was a successful businessman who late in life became the husband of serial killer Aileen Wuornos, the only time she married. Martin McMichael Hoyt was married to playgirl Eugenia Bankhead 3 times. Another time he jumped off an ocean liner to impress a girl. Fellow guide Tom Keels has 2 stories for you. Mabel Tinley Roloff's, one of the great con artists of the 19th century, and General Henry Morris Nagley, successful vintner who caused a scandal with his love life. Laurel Hill East is located at 3822 Ridge Avenue in the East Falls section of Philadelphia. An easy walk from the bus stop at Ridge and Allegheny for SEPTA buses 1, 61, and 82, formerly the R bus. Admission and parking in the lot across the street is free, but parking spaces are limited. You can also pull onto the grounds and park where you know you won't block anybody. And there's an app that you can download for a self-guided tour through its 78 acres. Laurel Hill West, 225 Belmont Avenue in Bala-Cynwyd. There's parking at the main entrance and at the bell tower. Public transportation, SEPTA Regional Rail to Manayunk, or one of the many buses to the Wissahickon Transfer Center on Ridge Avenue. Then cross the Schuylkill River on the Pencoid pedestrian bridge. Maybe stop at the restaurant there, grab a cup of coffee. Come up the Writers Ferry Road to the entrance near the Pet Cemetery. I have done downloads for self-guided tours at Laurel Hill West. If you download them, they will lead you on 40 to 45-minute audio tours. Talks about people who are interred along the bike route through the cemetery. Both Laurel Hill East and West are currently open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. We welcome all visitors, dog walkers, bike riders, photographers, painters, tree and plant lovers, skateboarders. Please come visit us. Keep your dog on a lead, but you're more than welcome to bring the pooch along with you. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook. You'll get a daily reminder of our inhabitants and activities. You can also follow All Bones Considered on Instagram and Facebook. The woman who does my podcast publicity says I have more than 800 followers on Instagram. And some of the TikTok promo videos have been watched more than 2,000 times. Can you believe that? Coming up on 70,000 downloads. Did you know? Here you go. Here's a little bit of trivia for you. In general, if a podcast is downloaded 120 times in the first 7 days after it has been posted, it is in the top 25% of downloads. I'm very pleased to say that All Bones Considered and Biographical Bites have been in the top 25% of podcasts for several months now. It's staying up there. In fact, I looked just a little while ago. There have been 160 downloads today. Once you have fallen in love with the hotspots at Laurel Hill, we invite you to become a friend of Laurel Hill. That way you have an opportunity for members-only special tours that are each year, including some Inside the Mausoleum tours. They are a couple of the liveliest spots in town, despite being cemeteries. Our theme song, Names at Peace, written and performed by local artist James Harrow. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories are research written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University, and you can reach me through my email, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. Keep body and soul together until next time on All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories, where the plot thickens. Stick around. You can hear the references that I used for this podcast. And until the next time we meet, stay safe, stay well, stay above ground. Bibliography up next. On Countess Santa Eulalia, Sarah Elizabeth Shindler Stetson, mostly newspaper articles. Let's see, 1907, Gossip Shadow on Count's title, Portuguese consul confounds detractors, Countess bride may face suit, Mrs. Stetson is a countess, no matchmaker says countess, Count Santa Eulalia in the limelight, Countess did not settle, see an early divorce, Countess comes to get mother, Countess dies, Hoosier Cinderella who rode in a hat fortune. And then, as I say, the Portuguese version of Wikipedia had quite a bit on the Count himself. I used Google Translate for finding out what that said in English. Marquis d'Eskens de Frenoys, but again, newspaper articles. Marquis called fake by Paris paper, seizes estate of Marquis, etc., etc. Baron James Ivan Michael von Suttka, newspaper articles, and Ancestry.com. I got his draft card there. I got some of his military record there. But everything else was out of the newspaper. Baroness Eugenia and Clarence Wiener came mostly out of the newspapers, but there is one website where the guy did an incredible amount of research on Clarence Wiener. I got in touch with him. We swapped what we had. I had some stuff he didn't have. He told me to use whatever I wanted in the podcast. Here we go. Epsom and Ewell History Explorer. That's eehe.org.uk. There is some wonderful information here on Clarence Wiener. I got probably 80%, 90% of the podcast from this. Princess Olga, same thing. Everything out of the newspapers. And then the personal correspondence I had with the grandson, Sergei Trebetskoy, who is in Virginia. So next time, if I ever get back around to this, I got 3 more for you eventually. Baron Arthur Fontana, Baroness Beatrice Bailey von Wullersdorf, and Countess Brockenhuis von Lowenhelm. Thanks for listening. There was some fun stuff this month. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground.